Hello, welcome to the Human Advantage. Today's conversation will be exploring what happens when strong values and purpose meet the realities of running organisations day by day, from leadership and impact to partnerships and decisions that shape how purpose actually shows up in practice. We're joined today by Lawrence Davis, founder of Power of Perspective Coaching, where he works with leaders and organisations, helping people bring more clarity and purpose into the way they lead and make decisions. Lawrence is also a trustee of Electric Storm Youth, the charity I have the privilege of leading, so it's especially lovely to welcome him to the podcast today. Lawrence, hello and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Really looking forward to the conversation.
Now, I've given an overview of, Power of Perspective. Obviously, I've done it in probably two lines, but clearly there's much more to you and your work, Lawrence. For anyone listening today and hasn't heard about your work, do you want to provide a brief summary of what you do to support people?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have been coaching people, particularly people that run companies and some executives in larger organizations since 2008, 2009. I've always done that as a kind of side gig, if I'm honest, until quite recently, where I've stepped more fully into that. In the meantime, I've kind of had quite an interesting and varied career in a number of different sectors and contexts that will probably come into the rest of our conversation. So that includes working in a charity, in the charitable sector, and in particular building a mental health in the workplace training team. So that was a big part of my journey, where we had some really amazing impact from that work and just countless learnings and insights from that. Sort of long story short, when the pandemic hit, I stepped out of that and into education technology. So the sort of startup world, the digital SaaS world, software as a service world, and I was kind of been in that for the last 5 years. And I'd basically been involved in setting up and scaling teams up to sort of 7-figure revenue, up to staff teams of like up to sort of 60 people that I've been heavily involved with. So I've seen a lot of different things over the years in different contexts. Coaching, coming back around to your question, so I still coach individuals and founders, is very central to what I do. I also offer kind of fractional consultancy, particularly around operations, around particularly where teams are growing, not exclusively, but particularly where teams are growing from like 5, 10 people into 20, 30, 40, 50 people. I've seen that journey a number of times, and there are so many interesting steps in that scaling journey that I particularly have insight into. So yeah, those are two of the ways that I work. And then the kind of third and last one I'll say is around mental health in the workplace, in organizations of any size. So that is the work that I used to do for the mental health charity, and I'm now kind of doing that on an independent basis, because there is just still a massive need out there for greater education and skills in that area.
Probably this connects to the mental health. I was thinking about when you mentioned about the mental health, and we often speak about maybe a ripple effect in society, and the deeper impact of touching on a life, on one person life. So when you are, for example, maybe communicating with partners or other organizations, what feel the hardest about translating, I would call like a philosophy, into something that creates something that is much more concrete, where they can act on? Because for some people, mental health is something that they are aware of, but they don't take the step to implement. Where do you feel is the hardest part, translating this philosophy or this like a less tangible thing into something that people can act on?
Yeah, I'm very about impact. I'm very focused on impact, and I'm a very practical, pragmatic person. So I've kind of I've got ideals as well. I'm quite ethically, centered and purpose driven, but I try and land that in real impact and practical steps. The mental health stuff is very, it's very important. I think where we're at actually socially, societally as well around mental health is that there has been a lot of awareness raising work done, and arguably that's slightly stalled in the last few years, if I'm honest. There was a big rising wave that I was kind of, myself and the team that I built were certainly a part of. We created that team in like 2015, and kind of I left that in 2020 when the pandemic hit. It sort of felt we were on this rising wave at that point. I'd say in the last few years since that, potentially the awareness raising and the kind of societal attitudes have kind of gone back a tiny bit, or at least that progress hasn't continued. But I do think where we're at is this need to go beyond awareness raising, and it's into skills, it's into like changes of culture and practice in organizations, which are actually much deeper than, I'm not going to sit here and knock mental health first aid, but mental health first aid is something that I've delivered and been part of programs where we've delivered large scale mental health first aid training. It's there's definitely lots of benefits in that, it's done in the right way, but it's not just about emergency and crisis response. It's about prevention. It's about creating sustainable human positive systems that and how you do that is a very practical thing that involves changes in culture, practice, and the skills of how you support mental health in a very practical way.
So since you have a lot of experience from a more maybe business point of view, despite you have already worked with the charities. Do you think it's quite difficult for a person to see how can I monetize with the mental health? Because mental health, the other day I was running a workshop, and we said the soil. We gave the example or analogy of the soil and the seed. So if you don't have a fertile soil, which is the environment where you work, for example, you can have the best employee, but it's quite difficult. So both of them, they're really they coexist. Where do you think would be beneficial? How can you translate something that's maybe some people they can't immediately translate mental health into something which is quantifiable? There is anything based on your experience that you think is the missing link?
Oh yeah, I mean, culture and practice is a complex thing, right?
Yes.
It's part of the picture here is when you're talking about culture and practice in an organization and how mental health is supported or isn't supported in groups, organizations, or in society more broadly. It can be hard for people to grasp that, and it's not also something that, going back to your seeds metaphor, is something that you can do overnight. It's like you can't grow a tree overnight. You can't, and cultures in organizations are things that do take time to shift. That is a reality. I mean, you can make big changes to the direction of travel of organizations and groups quite quickly, but it takes time for things to embed. The whole history of, say, for example, an employee sitting in a company that they've been in is going to influence that person's experience in the sort of here and now. So I think you've got to understand the breadth of what you're dealing with when you're talking about mental health at work. It very much relates to the whole experience of people's life cycle through that employment, through that role, that history with their organization. So I think that is part of it, is that things take time, and that I suppose to recognize the complexity, really, that you kind of need to look at culture through multiple different lenses to be able to see it clearly. You can't take one metric or one snapshot or one survey and think that you understand the culture in an organization. If you really want to understand that, you've got to be looking over time at a number of, through almost as many lenses as you can.
That's interesting. The work that Alessandro and I are doing with the 7+1 framework is very much that. It's made up of, hence the title, 7 steps. Each step in isolation can be done, but if you don't do them in succession, then obviously, there becomes gaps. There becomes a bit of a disconnect. So I think that's quite important. And also, I think, we're talking about culture and changes, Lawrence. In a purpose-led organisation where there's often times when the workload is stretched, teams are thin, because everything's important. How do you think, you decide what not to do when the cause itself matters so much?
Great question. And I completely agree with that. And sort of, I've absolutely been sitting in those shoes in a charity, under the pressure and the weight of the inbox and the various funder reports and everything and all of the pressures that are on you. And
so many organisations, they've got KPIs, haven't they, and targets.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then you might charity sector, certainly myself, you might have a safeguarding issue pop up. Like, how does that, which should trump everything else? You might have something going on with a team member, wellness in the team. So we could sit here all day and list all the pressures that are on charities and to be honest, other businesses and organisations as well. But the charity sector does have those pressures in a very particular way. I tend to believe, I strongly believe really that the way out of that reactive mode, it's one of the problems is you get into reactive mode. You have too much volume and of stuff, and the tendency is to just want to shovel harder, shovel the mountain harder. And I think you've got to recognize when you're in a position where that isn't actually achievable, the load that you've got in front of you is not doable, certainly not maintaining your own well-being in a sustainable way. And I think you've got to the really difficult thing is that you have to make time to step away, to step out of the shoveling that mountain, to look at the big picture and think, this mountain is too big for me to shovel. I can't shovel this. Like, I need to figure out how I can get myself a JCB, or how can we look at this mountain differently? Can we, work our way around it? Can we look at a different area? It's taking that time to look at the big picture, which is incredibly difficult when you're feeling that you're behind the curve and you're always trying to keep up with the day-to-day influx of the pressures. But I do think it's absolutely key to getting out of that reactive mode and into a proactive strategic place where you can actually do the highest impact and most important things on your list, because everything doesn't feel important, but that doesn't mean that it actually is as important. There are some things on the to-do list that will be more important than others. So it's finding the space to figure out what those are.
Yeah. We had a former podcast that we had, interesting conversation around they're already busy, but they're going to add some more services. And so I guess, is there a reflection on, actually we're adding more services, but actually what is working well right now, what's not? Do we look at what we've got in hand already? Or is it about building a framework or a structure around what's already there? What's your thoughts on that, Lawrence?
Again, I go back to the most important thing is to find space to make those kind of judgments with as clear a head as possible. Like, I do think quality of thinking is absolutely key. Like, basically, quality of thinking leads to better quality actions, which lead to better quality outcomes, like at the end of the day. And so the decisions the strategic decisions that you're talking about, do we take on these new services? Do we double down and really focus on what we're doing well already? I think the absolute key there is about finding the space to really make those decisions in a sensible way. I do think there is often a tendency to feel that we must go for new things, like, and that's a reactive knee-jerk thing, is that we must chase more all the time. And it's understandable. A lot of charity finances, particularly, not only charities, but there's that uncertainty of future income. So you want to solve that by running after the first thing that you see. But ultimately, a strategic approach is the one that will is most likely to lead you to sustainable, positive outcomes.
Had an interesting conversation, Alessandro, where we were talking about adding new services is maybe they're not putting a spotlight on what isn't working, and it's reflections of challenges. I don't know whether you want to add to our conversation we were exploring previously.
Yes, I usually say growth is action plus the reflection. Not everyone take action, but very, very few people act by also reflecting. Because if you don't reflect, you do, as you said, Lawrence, more and more, are you sure that you are going to the right direction? I'm not talking also about burnout, because that is the most common outcome. But reflecting is one of, for me, should be one of the metrics. How many times have we reflected this month about the direction? So I'm very curious, because I was sharing my opinion about why many people don't reflect. Some they act, but the majority they don't reflect. What might be, based on your experience, you have a very extended experience about, and we are talking the same language. Why do you think? Because many people say, Alessandro, I don't have time to reflect. This is a very, very common objection nowadays. What do you think it might be one of the reasons why they say that they don't have time to reflect, despite it's essential?
Yeah, really interesting question. I think it does go back to the pressures that people feel, and a lot of them are understandable, and also some of the just qualities of modern life. The pace, the information bombardment that we get as well, and the decision fatigue that we get through the pace of modern life. And again, it's why I do come back to that solution about finding time, because it's finding time to think strategically, and exactly as you say, part of that very great point that you make about reflection, because you need that space to reflect. Again, it's that the word to reflect has got that quality of, like, it's not something that you reflect in an instant. Reflection is a process that takes contemplation to a degree. It doesn't mean that you have to carve out like an unfeasible amount of time in your diary, but it's quality, not quantity as well. Like, I'm a big believer, for example, that in a practical way, of before you actually start responding to messages in the morning at the beginning of a work day or whatever, think for yourself about what your own priorities for that day are, and think really clearly. I like to write them down or type them down or whatever before I start responding to what's coming in, because it's like we're so easy to be reactive, because there's an unmanageable amount of information to process out there. So if your starting point is responding to all that, you're never going to find the space to do that quality of reflection and strategic thinking that is actually the solution. So it's like we're not given time. There is no time that lands on a plate. You have to make time. Yes. And it's like, even if that is a small amount of time, it's putting that in strategically as much as you can, to think about that big picture and actually think about bigger picture solutions, which are not necessarily like, how do I get through as many emails as I can today, but it's like, how do I create a situation where in a week's time, a month's time, 6 months' time, I'm in a fundamentally better position because of a key decision or action that I've taken right now.
I'm very curious. No, go ahead. I have a question then.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to reflect on what you were saying. I'm just thinking that's when the pressure starts to show. You don't make that time or write that simple list. The teams are feeling stretched, and communication then gets messy, and then individuals start carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders, and that's when mistakes start happening, and you lose sight of what the goal is or where you're headed. So yeah, I mean, I'm a great believer of reflection. It was part of the grounding of part of one of my qualifications, and I love it. You know, I love doing a piece of work, and nothing better than saying that worked well, but actually we could have done that better, or you know, how could we have, you know, elevated that program or the product or whatever, or that service. I think it's good to reflect. I think it's a very important skill set that all of us should be doing.
Absolutely.
For me, like a reflection, because when someone raised the objection, I don't have time, I usually ask, do you have a structure to structure your day? Do you think like the level of energy during the day, if you have a structure? Because many people in the lack of time management, and having a structure allowed you to be better at leveraging the time. Do you think like knowing during the day where you should put effort like could be one of the most important resources, would help a person to have more time to reflect? What's your point on that?
Yeah, I have to be slightly careful about my own bias in that, because I am a person that likes a lot of structure. So
Okay.
I'm a person that, well, in fact, you know, if I rewind a long amount of time, I was quite disorganized in my, you know, teens and early 20s, wherever. And I think I had to organize myself. And so I did become, and I have become, quite a structured person. And I do live by quite a strong schedule. I like, my favorite phrase around my schedule is flexible plan A.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I like to have a plan, but I like to be flexible in that plan as well. But when I talk about bias, it's like I think through coaching a lot of people, you kind of you get to see how different people are in a quite intimate way, and it's like it's not for everybody to be as structured as I am, for example. So it's kind of a mistake for me to try and impose that on, you know, on coaching clients or somebody else, because I can and do support people to do that when they want to do it and it's the right fit for them. But there are people, you know, there are people out there that work in very different ways and get good results and have happiness, you know, and I you know, absolutely not going to knock that. So I don't think it's the same for everybody. There are some principles, like, you know, the one that I said about think about your priorities at the beginning. I think for most people that is a really powerful thing to do, whether that means it's a sort of diarized thing where you know, do that in a systematic way, or it's just an awareness and it's an intention that you have that actually I'm going to just sort of think about that as the first thing that I do before I start my day. You know, it can look different to different people. I think it's a great question to ask yourself, is like, how is the structure that I've got in my days and my weeks working for me? Like, do I need more? Do I need less? You know, do I need more unstructured time? What actually works for me? And again, that goes back to that is the kind of question that you can ask in those reflective, strategic, big picture spaces. So yeah, but I am quite a structured person in the way that I work myself.
Brilliant.
To your ears, Alessandro, you are the king of time management. You have got a brilliant structure in place, haven't you?
Apparently, yes. Apparently, yes, because yes, I usually like divide the day in 3 parts with the level of energy, mental energy, and that allowed me to prioritize. And when someone say I don't have time, I usually share, you can create time.
Yeah.
I know that is very philosophical, but I use what is called Parkinson law. So if I say I'm going to do this task in 1 hour, it's going to take maybe 5 hours if you put in your mind, I'm going to do the same task in 5 hours. So we dictate the time. We need to be realistic. I can't say something that I'm going to do in 1 hour, something that usually takes 5 hours. But the more I put in my mind, okay, this is the time that I'm going to block from any distraction, and this is the level of energy that works really well with me. But as you said, Lawrence, it's not for everyone.
No. Lawrence, I'm with you though. You know, start of your day, what does it look like? What are the priorities? Otherwise you become a slave to everyone else's priorities, and then, you know, you become a backlog then. So yeah, I'm all for a good list and prioritizing things. So yeah, I think it's yeah, not for everyone, but certainly works for me. So Lawrence, I'm interested, you know, you spend a lot of time helping organizations and individuals to see themselves more clearly. When it comes to your own work, have you had an outside influence or perspective that has made a difference to you?
Oh, I mean, I've learned an awful lot along the way, in various different ways. I mean, I've done a lot of co-coaching, co-counseling. I've done a lot of I guess really my journey did start with self-reflection about myself, and actually it came out of turbulent experiences in my own mental health, in my sort of late teens, early 20s time that I mentioned before. I had some quite I had some really difficult times. I had some really dark times, and I looked at sort of dark options in the face in those times, and I came out of that, which is an amazing thing in one's life, and really started to examine myself and reinvent that personal transformation kind of process. And there's so many people along the way that have been part of that in terms of influences on me. Lots of people that I've learned from, shared with, been on parts of my journey with, even things like my original coach training that I did in 2008 in Canada, where I was at the time. But and yeah, I mean, there's just so many different things that I've done. Meditation is a thing that I did in terms of that personal transformation. I did martial arts for 20 odd years, with teachers that I really learned a lot from. I mean, yeah, there's so many people that I've learned from, and obviously colleagues, like mentors professionally, leaders that I've worked with, and I suppose to be honest, there's also just the learning of living the experiences that I've been through at this point. There's nothing. Some of my first experiences of really managing a bigger team were when I was in the mental health charity, Rethink Mental Illness, in, I don't know, 2014, I think. I had a significant promotion. I was suddenly responsible for loads of people that I hadn't been before. And a lot of people in management do have that kind of baptism of fire moment. That was, there's nothing like experience for teaching certain things.
Definitely. And I think a lot of people go networking but don't utilize it in the right way. I'm using networking because you're talking with other people. The most unlikely people you might meet, you don't know what doors are going to come open, you don't know what conversations are going to have. But I can guarantee each time I go to a networking event, and I go with intent for a reason, you always come away from something else. I think there's always a learning or a connection, a light bulb moment. And I think it's important to stay open, be impartial, listen, learn, because I think it can all add to not only our experiences, but we did that well, how can we do it better? Well, you had that conversation, or you saw that example, or you put in place a structure that actually suddenly brought everything together. And some of that learning comes from meeting other people and being in spaces perhaps you wouldn't ordinarily have been in.
100%, absolutely. And it is so important to be in that mindset around it. With networking is a great example of something where, if your mindset is very transactional and you're just trying to get something out of it specifically related to your organization, it's really difficult, and you lose that openness to learning from other people, to collaborations, to all the various other wonderful things that can come out of being open and being that learning and collaborative mindset. And so, I think networking is a great sort of microcosm of other aspects of mindset in relation to, your interactions and meetings with other people, businesses, organizations, etc.
Yeah. How important do you think it is? I mean, I'm going to relate to the charity sector here, because in particular, one of the challenges they have is language, a barrier. they talk in a certain way and they're not able to articulate who they are or what they do for a corporate or a business to understand. So you talk about mindset, we've touched on language. How important is all of that in your work?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely essential to be able to boil down and communicate what really you're trying to say, and it's deceptively complex to do that, because I suppose what you're always trying to do in that communication stuff is like boil down a lot of complexity into something which is really, really digestible to the audience that you're trying to reach. So yeah, I mean, that's certainly absolutely crucial in the charity sector. It's certainly also in the business sector, in the private sector. You know, if you're trying to reach any kind of client or customer, I mean, again, boiling down that message is absolutely crucial. And then there's also aspects around like internal communication as well that, you know, and how you boil down those, because it's just as important, is how you keep everybody on the same page. And it's that, like, yeah, simplicity isn't necessarily simple, is it? It's like how you simplify messages into their most digestible form, while retaining the impact that you want them to have. But yeah, it's all about communication. It's all about communication and people, and how we work effectively to communicate what we want to say.
An alignment, you've all got to be on the same page, haven't you? You might bring a different perspective to the table, but actually you've all got to be aligned in what's the goal.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, certainly it's also communication and clarity. So a lot of the coaching stuff that I do and work with organizations in other capacities is very much about clarifying. Like I'm such a huge believer in the transformative power of clarity, and it is one of the kind of magical things about the coaching process, and as well as, as I say, other similar processes with organizations, is when you really identify a problem as clearly as you possibly can. Often, a great deal of the time, the process of finding solutions comes automatically out of the process of getting clearer and clearer about what that problem is. It's like people overlook how important it is to do that, to just go over and clarify and really dig into what is the problem here, what is the issue, what are we trying to do, what's the goal, and people rush to solutions rather than I'm sort of, they come themselves when you've defined the problem or goal sufficiently.
I think before we come to a conclusion, I draw what you were sharing, so what I learned today. And for me, there are a lot of commonalities between the three of us. In particular, what I learned that we need to have the right mindset, because the mindset is going to influence the language, but not just externally between, for example, the professional or the business and the client, but also internally, is what I call like internal marketing. So if I have the right mindset, I positively influence my way of behaving, but that also level of clarity influence all the people that support my mission. But how can I do that is also throughout the mental health. So the language that I use for myself, the language that I use and influence the room also influence the mental health of me as like the sender, but also all the other people. And based on my experience, but you also share exactly the same, we need to have a structure. We can't do without any kind of structure. Whether we are more structured or less structured, that, as you said, is very personal. But clarity for me comes from a structure. And as you said, clarity comes from mindset, language, and mental health. So thank you for sharing with us this beautiful process. I would call like a process or journey.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really really wonderful and interesting to have fed back. It's it also, I just relate it back to culture and practice as well, the communication piece, and how we were talking earlier about how culture and practice is difficult to get a handle on or measure. And like one of the reasons for that is because it lives in that communication between people. It lives in the macro and the micro communications between people in organizations. So yeah, I mean, but thank you again for that lovely reflection. Thank you.
So thank you for joining us. I don't know if you have any things to share with us that we haven't asked you that would be useful for the audience, Lawrence.
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I guess.
Well, if someone want to contact you, for example, that is also something that we always ask. If someone want to contact you, are you on LinkedIn? Do you have a website? How, if someone wants to be in touch with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is a great way. It's probably the best way. You can just connect me, direct message me on LinkedIn. I have got a website as well with you can contact me through that. It's powerofperspective.co.uk. People always struggle to spell it. I should have come up with a shorter name, but you tell me that as a marketing person. But but yeah, I'd love to, please do get in touch if you've got any interest in what I'm doing, my approach, and any way that I might be able to help.
Okay.
Brilliant. Lawrence, thanks so much for joining us today. I know you wear many hats. Appreciate your work that you do to support us in the charity sector, but more importantly, the work that you're doing to, support organisations and lend them your advice and wisdom and skills. So thank you very much for joining us and sharing all that you have today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Lawrence.
Thank you.